I'm Brian Hora. Been farming since 1985 and full time. And our farm operation, I'm the manager of it and owner of the business. And been using no-till practices for off and on since I really began farming. Most years we were no-till, the corn into soybeans into the corn stalks, but anything that was corn on corn we were using tillage up until 2012. In 2012, I started messing around a little bit with some cover crops, and actually planted my first cover crops in the fall of 2013, it would have been, and have been working towards 100% cover crop on the farm since then. And since we now are essentially 100% cover cropped, and other than a few check strips. The last 4 years, we've been basically 100% cover cropped. As I mentioned, we run corn and soybeans, and Mitchell and I, through some of our practices and such, are testing a lot of other practices as well. Relay cropping, 16-inch row corn. We've raised some specialty crops in the form of mustard, barley, some wheat, and again, now we're using the relay crops. Regarding data, we've been collecting yield data for a long time. And in fact, I even started collecting soil data on a grid basis back in the early 90s. We started off with 5.4 acre grids and moved on to 2.5 acre grids not long after that. But since, I want to say it was in 2016, I think it was the summer of 2016, we started going to a zone basis, and now are doing all the farm with zone sampling. And those zones that we are collecting the data from are basically designed by soil type, productivity. But the zones that we work with are essentially 10 acre zones approximately. And did that more for economic reasons as anything. In that process of switching to zones, I also switched away from a traditional soil test, and everything we're doing now is using a Haney soil health test. It's a little more costly analysis of that. We get a lot more data out of it, and therefore our cost per acre really hasn't changed much because we're using that 10 acre zone instead of 2.5 acre grid. Did that for several reasons. The 2.5 acre grids, for the number of years, all the years I had grid sampled, and it would have been 20 plus years of gathering data in a soil sample on a grid basis, and essentially trying to variable rate fertilizer or treat parts of fields, trying to balance out the soil analysis and the data that we were collecting to make certain that the crop had enough, first of all, but we were trying to get more uniformity throughout the field. After doing that for a lot of years, I realized we're not balancing things out. Those areas that we need to bring the levels up, they are really hard to bring up. And the areas that were high, they remain high for a long period of time. So it's like, well, that's probably not really worth the effort to try to change that. So maybe I should be looking at the management zones, and that's where we're at now, where when you look at those soil types and some other things that may play into it, but soil type and yield, they follow each other pretty close, or especially with organic matter. High organic matter areas tend to be our best yielding, most consistent soils as well. So it made more sense to manage by those zones instead of a square block, if you want to put it that way. So since then, we've been using these zones, and we gather a lot of data and look back towards yield data and the results we're getting. The data that we're gathering is used for multiple things. And we've done a lot of testing of products, new types of products, soil amendment things such as the humic acids and other sorts of biologicals, nutrient enhancers, plant growth regulators, those types of a wide variety of things. And in that, with my use with Continuum Ag of running those tests, yeah, we're gathering a lot of data, and soil data is one of the primary things. If we're running tests for a company to look at their product, we're going to gather soil data. And again, it's almost always starts with the Haney soil health test. And that soil health test, we're gathering as much information as we can there because it's fairly new, a new process of gathering information, and we're trying to better understand what's going on in the soil. Trying to use a soil test taken every couple of years, 3 or 4, like we used to do. And we weren't changing things again. And I just want to understand better what's going on in the soil and what's going on with all the changes we're making with cover crops. And so some of this stuff, we've actually gotten to the point where we're pulling soil samples every week. This is year 4 of some areas that are on the farm here where we're sitting, where we have pulled soil samples every week from April through November. And in a variety of locations. They're not by grid. We're doing them by management practice, which those practices that we focused on are cover crop versus no cover crop. And now we're looking at this year, we're got more samples in relay crop versus, so we actively have rye growing yet, versus an area where we terminated the rye after planting. So that's the basis of a lot of our data, and gathering that information. Of course, we got to have good yield results, a lot of records regarding the placement and application of the products, and the development of reports and understanding of what's going on in the field and what's impacting nutrient content of the soils, yield, and other variables that might be showing up. So in dealing with the soil health testing and the conversion of the farm to soil health, and the focus on soil health, we really kind of started on this. First knowledge of it would have been in 2015, which was the year before we actually started testing. I mentioned earlier we really started using the Haney test in 2016. But in 2015, when again, I was dealing with Mitchell, and he was in an internship, and that internship was dealing with a soil health test, and I had not heard of it prior to that. And about that summer is when all of a sudden I started noticing the term soil health showing up in the farm magazines and the farm media. Ever since then, it has been a hot button. But that was something that we had not focused on in the practices for all the years before, all my years of farming, 30 years of farming prior to that. When we looked at soil data, we were looking at the chemical composition and maybe the physical characteristics as well. So, but primarily the chemical composition of the soil with the soil test. Never did we look at what was going on with all the biology other than what the plants were. Okay, we looked at the corn or soybean plants and weeds and insects, above ground insects or insects in general that would be affecting the crop, but that was the extent of the biology. What we were missing was all of the microbial biology that's in the soil. What's going on with earthworms and all the drivers of real soil health in the entire ecosystem, if would be the proper term for it. So the ecosystem, obviously, it's a balance of or takes into account the 3 components of the physical characteristics, the chemical characteristics, and the biological characteristics of the soil or the environment, the soil in this case. So in the years that I've been doing this prior, as I mentioned, the tillage practice every 3rd year, otherwise we were no-till. Some farms were continuous no-till because it was a strict corn soybean rotation. Never really noticed anything going on with biology. And even the first few years of our testing and switch to cover crops, the testing with the Haney test and the switch to using cover crops, we didn't notice a lot of biological activity in the soil beyond the plants and the bugs, as I'll call them, the pest bugs that we had to deal with. But about 3 years in, After listening to some things from some other growers, I remember Mitchell working with a grower by the name of Steve Berger, and Steve was talking about not having any residue left on his fields after he, raising cover crops for years, but his fields don't have any residue left on them. And I'm like, well, that's kind of odd. Why would they not have residue left? But a few years into this, all of a sudden, like third and fourth year of us using continuous cover crops, I noticed the same thing. All of a sudden, we'll go out there in July and there's no residue left. It's all gone. The previous, especially in a corn crop, where we got 30-inch rows. The drilled bean situation, we still had residue, but the corn crop is where the residue completely disappeared. And we had black soil on the surface. So started doing some looking around, and we could tell earthworms were everywhere. Something that we had not noticed previously. And in this process, those first few years when I started seeing this, some other fields that had not had cover crop on them as long, fields that we were farming, or some things that I was doing in a field that was just down the road that was custom farmed, they still had a lot of residue left in July. Those fields hadn't been cover cropped, they didn't have the biology there yet. And so one of those things that we didn't have, we didn't understand it, we didn't spend much time on it. Now that we're into this process several years, the biology is one of the key drivers for us. It was a very big surprise to me of what was going on. And that challenge of trying to deal with that is where we're at now. The challenge to the soil health really is understanding how to manage the residue, the cover crop residue, the regular crop residue. And I don't want to call it trash. We always used to call it trash on the surface, but it's not trash, it's residue. It's residual plants that carry the residual nutrients that are going to go back in to feed our crop. So it's our food bank, essentially, and we shouldn't even call it a residue anymore. It's basically the food bank for the rest of the entire ecosystem, the microbes, therefore the plants as well. So that's been the challenge, and that's where we're at now, multiple years into this, trying to increase and to balance out the food system, the food supply for our ecosystem, which again is that residue. So whether that's a combination of products, and especially going into corn or going into soybeans, following a corn crop, we will use pretty much just rye, cereal rye. And we're introducing some new varieties of rye. This is our first year using Elbon rye, and I really like the looks of it. In fact, we could probably talk about this here in a minute with the relay cropping. All of our relay crop this year is Elbon rye, and I like the looks of it. In the past, we've just been using cereal rye that we've been producing ourselves in the relay crop system. So, but going into the corn crop, following soybeans, we're trying to introduce other species of cover crops, trying to diversify the blend, therefore adding more diversity to our soil biology, giving them other food sources, but also trying to find some plant species that will carry us further into the summer, and their degradation will continue to provide a food supply. So that's kind of how we've tried to overcome that, and that's one thing that most people have to deal with is getting those that diverse mix of cover crops and a plan in place that really works for your situation. And everybody's situation is probably going to be worse or will be different. A little further on some of those challenges we've dealt with, and I know there's a lot of growers that have the challenge of getting cover crop seeded, getting it done timely, getting uniformity. In our situation, we've been using a drill to drill all the cover crop in the fall. We're actually going to go to an air seeder this year on a Great Plains turbo till for seeding this summer or this coming fall. Trying to speed the process up a little bit and be a little bit easier on our equipment. That timing, that's one of the concerns a lot of people have is, do I have time to do this in the fall, to seed all this stuff down? So we're trying to figure out one way to speed it up, but still be very efficient with what we're doing. Uniformity is extremely important of the cover crop growth. because we're using cover crop for weed control. And I was just, here we are at the end of June, and I was just out yesterday scouting beans, trying to decide what I need to spray for herbicides. And as of right now, most of those beans, other than our relay crop, those beans only have one application of Roundup on them, and that was to terminate the rye. But that also took out all the weeds. One farm, I guess I did use the Roundup with Enlist in it because it was later sprayed, and there was some ragweed pressure, so we used the Enlist to take out the bigger ragweed. But in a lot of the places I go out there right now, there is essentially no weed pressure at all. And I have very, very little invested in the herbicide program. Use of the cover crop and getting that uniformity provides that shading of the ground, and we have great weed control because of it. So those are the challenge. Like I said, the challenge we dealt with was, or have been dealing with, is the cover crop. The huge benefit is what we're seeing in soil health, biological activity, a balanced ecosystem, and on top of that, increased weed control. And we can also discuss, if we need to, a little bit about the fertility balance that we've been seeing as well. Okay, so when it comes to determining species, I can what types of cover crops I want to plant, I can plan that out in advance. I know that on most of my acres, I'm probably going to use cereal rye. This year, as I stated, we're going to harvest our own cereal rye. It's going to be this Elbon cereal rye. Understanding it after planting it for a year, I know I'm going to get real good rapid growth in the fall, but it's going to break dormancy early in the spring as well, and I'm going to get really good growth. A lot of leaf area, thinner leaves than typical cereal rye, but a lot of early growth, and therefore I kind of got to manage determine in front of which crop I'm planting this, whether it's corn or soybeans that's going to follow it. So I know I'm going to use the rye in the species and in the blends. We're into this far enough now where, as I mentioned, we want to try to keep as much residue around as possible during the summertime, but I also have to be really careful. If I'm going in front of corn, I don't want this stuff too big in the spring, the rye. I don't want it too big or too thick, because if it gets too big and too thick, I start to run into basically it's the carbon penalty. I've got too much residue, too much carbon out there. It's maybe pulling more nitrogen out of the ground than I want, and it's just harder to manage. So we're at a stage now where I'm looking at adding oats into my fall blend if it's going to get planted early. So if I'm going to plant in September or the first half of October, I've got enough time to get some good growth out of oats. It will winter kill in our area. It's going to get frozen off, and it will die. I also try to use some sort of a legume. We've tried a few different things, and our best luck right now has probably been with hairy vetch. So we're going to be using that more in our blends. We've tried some clovers. We've used some radishes. Had decent luck with rape. Those species will all do a pretty good job of overwintering. And I'm not talking about using large, heavy rates of them. It's just a pound or two per acre. Something that will enhance my nutrient availability and bringing nutrients to the surface for the crop that I'm going to raise, but also trying to diversify the species that I have in the field. Since we're in a 2-crop rotation, I want to diversify the plant species that are out there to add and feed more biological activity. So the species of the types of cover crop is going to be determined primarily by what crop is going to follow it. So I want those blends ahead of corn. I'll use pretty much just straight cereal rye in front of soybeans. We've had problems in the past of getting access to those crops or those seeds. So when we couldn't get cereal rye one year, we used wheat. And I really like wheat early in the process of adopting cover crops. Wheat is kind of the opposite of Elbon rye versus regular cereal rye, in that wheat breaks its dormancy a lot later in the year. So the growth in front of a corn crop is a lot slower in the spring. Therefore, there's not near as much competition to the corn. Cereal rye is kind of in the middle. The Elbon rye is early, as I stated. But then the other thing that comes to mind is if I'm trying to determine which species to use, that depends on when I'm planting it. And if I'm harvesting in September in our geography, I could get some really good growth out of some of the rye, even the clovers and vetches. In fact, last year we had rye that was close to 12 inches tall before it was taken out by a frost. Did that in a corn-on-corn situation on not a lot of acres, a small area of acres, but corn came off extremely early, and it was a goal to get that corn out early, plant the cover crop back into it, get a lot of degradation of the corn stalk residue that was there, and also to get that cover crop established, because I was going to apply my nitrogen in the form of anhydrous in the fall, and if I have the cover crop growing, that holds all those corn stalks in place, and my anhydrous applicator, or if you were using strip till, those machines would go through that material a lot better because there's something holding the corn residue in place. We're in the mode now where we're actually trying to get most of our corn crop out early. It'll be a priority to get corn out of the field this fall. Gone to real full season soybeans. Some of the latest maturities I've ever had in soybeans is what I'm raising this year. And a couple of reasons for that. One, I love getting the corn out early, because if I'm drying corn, I'd much rather dry in September, early October than mid-November. It's just way more efficient. And also this past year, after the pressure that we're starting to see from the diseases, especially tar spot, I don't want to let corn stand in the field very long. The stalk quality deteriorates too fast with the tar spot. Therefore, I want to get this stuff out early. And then the soybeans, like I say, I'm using fuller season soybeans. So that's going to introduce a challenge for me as to how I'm going to establish my cover crops after taking soybeans out at the latter half of October instead of the 1st of October. So I'm not looking at really doing much for soybean harvest until after the 15th of October. And it'll be pushing right up into early November before we get it all done. Part of that is because of the maturities, but also we've got soybeans that are growing in a relay crop situation. And it's kind of the third part of this is how do we choose what we're doing here with the relay crop? Well, the relay crop rye that we have is intended 100% for our own purposes of next year's seed for the cover crop. And the whole intent with it is really to improve our return on our investment on our land. What we have found out when I went into it on the relay crop, the first couple of years, we were thinking, well, if we get 40 bushel of the acre rye and 40 bushel of the acre soybeans, that's a pretty good deal, and that's probably going to be better than just raising 60 bushel soybeans. Well, as we've gone through this, what we're looking at more is that we will raise, probably the goal is 30 to 35 bushel acre rye, knowing that that rye is worth, since I'm using it as seed, I don't have to go out and buy the seed. So the value of it's $15 to $20 a bushel, depending on where that shakes out for the year. So essentially the rye is worth just as much as the soybeans. If I can get 30 bushel of acre rye, and I'm pretty certain we're going to see that this year, just based off of what I'm seeing in the field, my soybeans in this environment, I expect them this year to out yield the soybeans in the rye crop that has been terminated, my normal system, if you want to put it that way. The last couple of years, we've been within 3/4 of a bushel yield on soybeans in terminated cover crop versus when we went full scale relay crop. So the economics on the simple returns, basically what I'm looking at is if I didn't have the relay crop there, in order to get that type of revenue income, I need to be raising 100 bushel acre soybeans. And I haven't seen that yet in this area. But I think I can do it consistently to get the revenue that would be equal to that using the relay cropping system. The other benefit is, okay, when I have the relay cropping, I've got one additional expense that I would not normally have. That's a guarantee that you're going to have, and that's the harvesting. Okay, I'm running the combine over the field twice in a year. The only other thing that I'm doing different with the relay crop is I am using a fungicide on the rye at this point to try to improve my yield and the quality of the rye that I'm getting. On the flip side, in the relay crop rye, as of right now, there are 0 herbicides applied to it. And I think on most of it that we have, there will be 0 herbicides applied this year. So that's pretty significant savings in the cost of the chemicals, but also in the applications of the herbicide itself. I don't have those expenses either. So the simple basic economics of inputs versus expenses tells me that this is kind of a no-brainer. I should be doing this. The hidden value in the process that we have found out, though, is what's happening to the soil in that ecosystem that we talked about. Through the soil sampling that we've been doing and pulling Haney soil health tests on an annual basis in the zones, we can kind of track what's going on. But this year, we actually are pulling soil samples on a weekly basis inside the area where it's cover cropped or has the relay crop, and then also beside it where the cover crop was terminated. So one of the things that we know right away is that as of 2 weeks ago, we ran a test, a real-time carbon dioxide test in the field was showing that where the relay crop is growing, the amount of carbon dioxide in the soil in the top 6 inches was 2 times the amount in the soybeans that were in the ground that the rye had been terminated just a week and a half earlier. So huge bump or huge level of microbial activity is being maintained for a longer period of time where I have the relay crop growing. And that's making nutrients more available to the crop, both the rye crop and the soybean crop. And the results we've seen in the past, that has resulted in as much as an additional 60 pounds of nitrogen available to next year's corn crop versus where we would terminate the rye. So in other terms, if I was giving the traditional old way of saying my soybeans, I need to take a 40 pounds of nitrogen credit for soybeans going into the corn crop, therefore I'm reducing my nitrogen by 40 pounds. In our relay cropping system, our number is 40 pounds, it's 100 pounds. And almost all of that in our system is we're running about 100 pounds of organic nitrogen in the field, according to our test results. And that's the credit that I can take and reduce my synthetic fertilizer application. I've got soil data that shows it. We've got yield results that show it works. And so that's a huge takeaway that was a real surprise. And that's value that is not being credited to the income for the corn or for the soybeans and the rye for the year. That's value for next year's crop. So when it comes to determining how did we start with these cover crops and which ones and why, the default program for the first few years that we were doing this was because of the incentives here in the state of Iowa from the Department of Ag that we could get cost share monies for planting cover crops. And the default rate in product was cereal rye. And the recommendation was, if you're ground applying it, was a bushel to the acre. Rates were higher if you were putting it on with the plane, but we were putting it on with the drill. So the default rate for that cost share was a bushel to the acre. First year, I will admit that was too much. We should have used lighter rates. And if I were to recommend anybody, I would tell them the same thing. First year, try to establish for 30 pounds to the acre. That's plenty. Because your system, your soil, your ecosystem is not ready for a full bushel yet. If you do plant a full bushel, you better follow the guidelines of terminating 2 weeks prior to planting because you're going to run into a huge carbon penalty if you let it go too far. It gets risky. I shouldn't say you're going to run into it. You increase your risk of running into that problem. We've moved to the lighter rates, and we use the lighter rates for a few years, and now we're starting to up the rates. But we also are planting everything green, corn and soybeans. Essentially, planting green is I haven't sprayed anything yet, and I'm planting my corn or soybean crop. And we love to plant into the green, and the basic, simple reason for doing it, for me, well, there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, if I terminate 10 days to 2 weeks ahead of time, as recommended, that would have probably been around the 10th of April this year, and that would have turned into maybe 3 weeks by the time we planted the last week of April. But had it, for the majority of our acres, we didn't plant till the 10th or 12th of May. So we would have terminated a month in advance of planting, just because the weather changed on us, and we would have had a mess. Well, I shouldn't say we would have had a mess. We would have had a wasted time frame of 1 month where I could have been capturing photosynthesis, capturing carbon in the world that we're dealing with now. I had a whole month there that my grass really hadn't even started to grow this spring as the first part of April. So we're trying to push that further, and most planters, well, all equipment, doesn't matter what you're running. I mean, if you have to worry about if the grass gets big, about tangling things up, possibly. But if I'm running a disc opener through there or a coulter, that disc opener or coulter is going to cut that fresh, succulent green leaf in those actively grown roots way faster and way easier than they will anything that is partially dead. It's no different than if you were to go out and grab a handful of grass and try to rip green grass. You can rip that green grass easier than you can rip stuff that's been dead for 3 or 4 days and in the process of dying down. So when I was the advice, from the protocols for that program were cereal rye. After you get into it for a few years, the advice still really is the basic fallback. The default program is cereal rye, because cereal rye does such a good job of developing a big root mass, and it grows early in the spring, grows well in the fall, overwinters really well. When you start running other species of cover crops in there, you run some risks of not having things survive. Winter wheat, for example, in this area, the year we did it, we had a lot of ice. We lost a lot of wheat. Didn't have a great stand the following year. Rye is simple and easy, but we're moving to the point where the rye isn't enough anymore. So we have to use the other species, and we want to use the other species to build our fertility with those legumes especially. So still trying to work through that, and I know that process of what we're going to use is going to change every year, because the further we go, the further we have to develop that process and the mixes of what we're using. When it comes to those other species, I go to my local cover crop provider for the information as to, okay, what do you have, first of all? What fits my situation? In our case, we're not grazing anything. If you have cattle or any other livestock that you're going to graze on it, you're going to be looking at different species just to feed them versus what we're trying to do, because we're only trying to feed the livestock that's in the ground for us. That's our crop, and that's our chores that we have to deal with, is feeding those guys in the ground. So the services that we've been using is soil health testing, and I'm kind of I'm the early adopter. I'm the first adopter of the processes, and by far the heaviest user right now of the soil health test that they're dealing with. But we're doing, this year, we're going to average probably 1 test per acre on the farm with all the tests that we're running through the summertime. And I said, most of our zones are 10-acre zones, but we've got certain areas that are getting a lot of tests taken. And in that process, we're trying to determine multiple things. I'm looking at it from the agronomic end of it. How are those nutrients and all the information that we're gathering from the farm affecting the crop, and the practices that we're using agronomically, such as relay cropping, termination dates on cover crops, And then even on our strips where we don't have the cover crop, how is that impacting nutrient availability? So that's coming back through the soil test. And then we're adjusting fertilizer rates and products that we're using that are supplying nutrients as well, because we're not just using fertilizer to provide nutrition anymore. We're using biological products. We're using other chemistry type products, and most importantly, we're using plants to supply nutrients to the cash crop that we're trying to raise. But I guess the third part of that is we're using those cover crops, those plants, to feed the biological system that's in our soil as well. So cereal rye, again, one of those plants that deep roots, so we can bring nutrients up from down deep, but also we're feeding microbes deeper into the soil. We're getting more aeration, more porosity, better structure of the soil, gets oxygen deeper. So we're increasing the size of the grocery store is what we're doing, because these things are coming to the grocery store to eat, or the restaurant, whatever you call it, either way. They're coming there, and the bigger we can make that table for them, that's what we're trying to do. And so we're laying out as many different things as we can and give them the whole, the favorite food of the commercial you see is, what's your one favorite food? And the guy says, well, it's easy, it's the buffet. We're trying to provide a buffet and to the microbes, and that's best thing that we can do. So when we're pulling soil samples, and I mentioned that we're taking a lot of soil samples, one of the things that I want to understand as a grower, and that not many of us do understand, especially with this new test, is when's the right time to take the test? And that all depends on what information I'm looking for. But for me, I want to know ahead of time, before I go into the season, where am I at with my nutrition for the crop, the cash crop that I'm going to have. And I can't continue down the road to sample every week on a very large scale. But what I do understand is that if I'm pulling this soil health test in the spring and I'm looking at the chemical composition of the soil, and then also the biological activity, and that activity basically is in the form of utilizing a carbon dioxide soil respiration test. So the one thing that we have noticed by pulling these tests starting the 1st of April and running through the end of November is that our biological activity really starts to pick up about the second week or so of May. Through the month of April, it's pretty steady. So the microbes are waking up from their winter, they're starting to get active, and by the second week of May, all of a sudden the carbon dioxide, that respiration number, starts to climb fast. And when I look at the pool of data that goes through the soil lab, by the time you get to the 1st of June, on the average, most of those tests drop in their carbon dioxide. A couple reasons for it. A couple reasons for both, why it's ramping up and why it's dropping, and it makes perfect sense. In the spring, as the ground temperature warms up, typically a very steady moisture supply. Sometimes it might be excessively wet, maybe a little dry, but usually there's ample moisture. There's a huge food supply sitting there. The microbes kind of go crazy and they start reproducing, and we get tons of microbial activity. By the time you hit June, in certain environments especially, you might be getting too hot and too dry, and too hot and too dry shuts microbes down. And then also their food supply might be running short, their readily available food supply. So the one thing that we're trying to do in our environment, by going with more growth on cover crop, and especially not terminating rye, cover crop, and soybeans until the last part of May if possible, I provide a lot more shade to the ground and can keep that environment where the microbes are living much more consistent. And therefore, our results, especially here the last year or two, we've seen that as we let that cover crop get bigger, our biological activity will continue to increase throughout the entire month of June, and we don't really start decreasing until July. July hits, a couple things are happening again. That soil temperature is coming up. The last several years, we've gotten some really, really dry periods during that time frame, which not having any moisture kind of shuts the microbes down. But also, as I mentioned, our residue is disappearing. So the food supply is starting to run short too. So that's slowing the microbes down, and we see an uptick again. Then, as we get towards the end of August, first part of September, we start getting a whole bunch of new biological activity, and which is followed then by more nutrients becoming available. And the one that's been a real surprise to us several years ago, well, really when we first started the process, was the amount of nitrogen in the soil that was available in a corn crop in the month of August was extremely low. We'd used it all up, which is a good thing. We don't want excess nitrogen at the end of the crop year. But by the middle of October, we had all kinds of nitrogen available again. And it's pretty easy to understand that, you got some moisture, you got some cooler temperatures, the microbes all get active, they break down the rest of organic matter that's there, and you have this huge influx of nitrogen in October. Problem is there's no crop to take it up. So those first few years when we did that, and we weren't pulling weekly samples at that point, we were doing monthly samples, and we did them through the entire winter. But what we saw is in those areas where that nitrogen came back up in October, we got cover crop that actively grew in the fall. Those areas that had cover crop that got 6 inches tall or so in the fall, by November and December, our nitrogen levels were back down at a more reasonable level. And I'm talking, 25, 30 pounds of nitrogen became available in October, almost all nitrate nitrogen. By December, that was down to about 5. Where we did not have cover crop, that 25, 30 pounds of nitrogen that was available in October, it stayed there until March at 25 to 30 pounds. And in March, it dropped down to single digits. It did not go into the cover crop though. It went down through the soil and out of the soil profile. So there's 25, 30 pounds of nitrogen that we flat out lost. And our cover crop pulled it up. And the next summer, when the cover crop died and broke down, the residue broke down, that nitrogen all became available to our crop. So the process, when you stop and think about how it would work in biology, it makes perfect sense. Through all of the tests that we have at Continuum Ag, it's validating the processes of what nature and biology intended to do. And it just, as we're taking it to the next step now, it's trying to get that system even more efficient. So, and the best use of the system is to, and what we're trying to do really in all crop production is we're simply capturing energy from the sun. And I got to do that with green plants as long as I can possibly do it. So we're trying to get as much green growth and green cover out there 12 months of the year. And even in the spring, if I'm terminating or if I've got corn or soybeans planted, I want that green crop growing in there as much as I possibly can till that next crop can take over and capture all the sunlight. Thinking of the beginning and where I started in this process, if I were to have information in front of me that would have expedited my process to get to where I am right now, I would love to have had all the soil data that I've got right now, but I know that's not possible because we're the ones creating some of that. But there was opportunities for me to get expert information. Several different groups or individuals were out there, and we have since began to work more with some of those individuals. And I went to some of the programming, but I probably should have brought on, and if I was real serious about advancement quick with this, I probably could have brought on an expert and hired somebody to give me a direct plan as to these are the cover crops that you need to do, and this is what's going to work for your situation. I went to enough meetings to understand the general direction that it needed to go, and that I had the confidence in listening to these guys and gals, and there's primarily some farmers in this area that we live that have been doing this for cover crops for a long time, having huge success, great yields, good returns. But I'm not certain that I didn't get a plan out of it because every year is a little bit different. So I didn't really adopt that plan to my specific need. So a lot of the stuff on our farm ended up being trial and error. And the trial and error, it is a good way of learning, but it's a slower process, obviously. But we also use a lot of different products, and that product testing was part of the Continuum ag business, of course, but it's also part of my farm business. So gathering a lot of data and information is the biggest key. I'm happy with the equipment that I have. I have made some changes, obviously, from where I was when I started, really almost 10 years ago now. We're still using a drill. We have been using a drill to plant cover crop. Next year that changes. The planter I use for corn, we did add starter fertilizer to it. Not that I thought that I needed the starter fertilizer as much as I wanted to add some of the biological products that are available now. And the most efficient way to do that for me, and the most effective way to do it for test results and product trials, was to put that on the corn planter itself. So those are a couple big things. I use a standard anhydrous toolbar that has been retrofitted to be a 12-row bar that matches the 12-row planter. We do you want to call it a poor man's strip till, but I don't want the coulters in the ground anyway, because I'm going for minimal soil disturbance when I put anhydrous on. Fall applied anhydrous only. I won't put it on the spring. It'll do too much damage. I do not want to disturb microbes if I don't have to, and I especially don't want to put anhydrous on during the month of May or June, because as I stated before, that is the highest and most risky time frame to destroy my microbes. So I want to leave them alone as much as I can. Let them do their thing. So yeah, the input, I would seek advice. You can make equipment work. There's somebody else out there that's already doing the same thing, using the same equipment you probably have. But go get those services and then monitor very closely what you're doing. A lot of ways to do that, but soil tests is a great way of doing it. So our plan moving forward, I have ideas in mind where I want my operation to go, and some of the things that I see need to be changed yet to make me more efficient, better utilizing this system. And the best advice I can give to anybody is go find an expert that can help you. There are tons of them out there. A lot of them they're willing to help, collect the data, prove to yourself, convince yourself that this is the way to go. There are plenty of people that can help you with that process.